Hi everyone, it's Miss Pacha here. So in this video, I will be reading section 2.1 Bantu migrations to you. This is on page 370 and 371 of your textbook. So you can listen and follow along with me as you read along. Okay, so 2.1 Bantu migrations. Main idea. Bantu-speaking people migrated from West Africa and influenced the language and culture of the African continent. As you have read, sub-Saharan Africa's varied physical features support a variety of crop today. About 10,000 years ago, an agricultural revolution began in Central Africa. During the agricultural revolution, humans began to grow crops instead of gathering plants. So this means that the people before the agricultural revolution were hunting and gathering. And then when they started to farm, which is the agricultural revolution, they started to grow plants and have farms. Sometime after the agricultural revolution around 2000 BC, one of the greatest migrations in human history began, the Bantu migration. By AD 1000, Bantu peoples had spread from their Central African homeland south and east across sub-Saharan Africa. So we're going to pause here and we're going to look at the map on the side. So as you can see, this map shows the Bantu migration. And originally the people came from this part of East Africa, of Central East Africa. It's near Lake Chad. And then they slowly started to spread down into sub-Saharan Africa to the west and to the south. So over time, they continued to spread, and then more and more different Bantu groups of people developed, and different civilizations developed throughout Africa. Okay, the Bantu people. People migrate for economic, political, religious, social, and environmental reasons. When groups of people move, cultures blend, new languages form, technology spreads, and sometimes conflict occurs. So I'm going to pause here. So think about, a lot of you have family from different parts of the world that have settled in Upper Darby, or maybe you have moved from one part of the United States to another, or from Philadelphia to Upper Darby. Or maybe your family has lived there for a long time and you're not exactly sure where they've come from. But people move to different places for different reasons. So for example, my grandparents migrated from Italy to the United States because they were looking for jobs after World War II. And in Italy, after World War II, there was an economic depression. So there wasn't a lot of jobs anymore. So my grandparents moved here in order to get a job. So when people move from one place to another, they move for a certain reason. Maybe some people's families have moved for religious reasons, that the religion they practice in one country, their original home country, wasn't acceptable, and so they had to move somewhere else in order to practice that religion. Or maybe there was an environmental disaster. Maybe some people moved from a place that had a really bad hurricane and then it destroyed their home, so they had to move somewhere else. So the Bantu people originally migrated because of these types of reasons. So I'm going to continue reading now. Historians and anthropologists are not certain why the Bantu chose to migrate when and where they did. Whatever the reason, the Bantu people began to move and carried their cultural traits and skills along with them. So they didn't exactly have a reason, like I was saying my grandparents did. Historians and anthropologists can't figure out the reason. But as they did move, they started to bring these cultural traditions with them, and then different cultures of sub-Saharan Africa developed from the original Bantu people. The Bantu had knowledge of iron working, and their use of iron weapons gave them an advantage over the other tribal groups. As the Bantu people moved, they forced other groups to move or become absorbed into Bantu culture. So they said, you have to accept our culture and adopt it, because they were seen as the more powerful group. Many different groups that became part of Bantu culture kept much of their own culture as well. As a result, nearly 85 million people who trace their history to the Bantu migrations share a very diverse culture today. So even though they had to accept some Bantu cultural characteristics, they also kept their own. So it's kind of this blend of cultures, which we've learned about in regions like the Caribbean or in South America with blending of the religions. Remember, we learned about how Catholicism and native religions kind of blended together and people practice both. So now we're at the top of page 371. Bantu languages. Today, people whose ancestors were Bantu exist in more than 400 ethnic groups, including the Zulu, the Swahili, and the Kikuyu. Original Bantu languages have evolved into more than 450 languages. So, what the text is explaining is that people spoke this original Bantu language and then it developed into other ones. So, there's a mix of this language throughout different languages. Swahili is one of the best known of the surviving Bantu languages. For more than 5 million people, Swahili is the language they learn as children, or their first language. So some of you have a first language. It's a language that you learned when you were a child, whether it's English or Spanish or Arabic. Everyone has a first language. So for example, my first language is English, but throughout school, I learned French. And if I was fluent in that language, French would be my second language. For 30 million people, Swahili is their second language. Swahili is spoken mainly in East Africa and can be heard in several different forms or dialects. So dialects, we learned about this when we were learning about Europe. They are different versions of the same language. Swahili is heavily influenced by the Arabic language. Arab traders from northern Africa and the Bantu-speaking people of eastern Africa met and exchanged goods over many centuries. Over time, Swahili became the language used to conduct trade. So Swahili started to gain this Arabic influence as well, blending the language even more. Beginning in the early 19th century, Arab trade caravans, which are groups of merchants traveling together for safety, traveled farther into the interior of Africa, spreading Swahili to more people. So, because of trade, the Swahili language spread. Eventually, Swahili would be used by some Europeans who colonized parts of Africa where the language was spoken. Today, many areas in Africa have two groups of people with different first languages. In these areas, Swahili is frequently spoken by both groups as a way to communicate. So some people's first language may not be Swahili, but they speak Swahili in order to communicate with other groups of people. As a result, Swahili is the lingua franca, or common language between multiple groups of people. So there might be different groups of people in this region of sub-Saharan Africa that have a different first language, but then they speak Swahili as a common language to communicate with different groups of people. So, as you can see from our map, as the Bantu migration happened, also the language migration happened. So people started speaking Swahili and it started spreading throughout this region as well. So the Bantu migration forced cultural exchanges and developed a new culture, and then also forced language spread, and then new languages developed. So that is section 2.1, Bantu migrations.